Blake Anderson was always the most confident man in the room. As the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the United States, he accumulated wealth and success like no one else. At 35, his life seemed perfect. Lavish villas, luxury cars, and a constant entourage of people eager to flatter him. To Blake, the world was a chessboard where he always played to win. One Saturday afternoon, he found himself with friends in a rather unusual place for someone of his status, a crowded McDonald's in the city center. The outing was just a game for them, a way to entertain themselves in a world far removed from their daily lives. Between bites of a burger he found mediocre, Blake started a conversation that would change his life. "I bet you'd never have the guts to marry a girl from here," one of his friends said, laughing. Blake, stung in his pride, scanned the room and set his eyes on a waitress with her hair tied up in a messy bun. Her name was Emily Carter. A simple yet lively young woman, she was nothing like the sophisticated women in Blake's circle. Intrigued by her genuine smile, he accepted the challenge on a whim. To everyone's surprise, Emily agreed to the proposition, amused and aware of the game. Yet, over the weeks, Blake discovered a woman unlike any he had ever known. She was neither impressed by his wealth nor awed by his power. Instead, she taught him humility, the value of simple things, and the joy of an unpretentious life. What had started as a bet turned into a profound personal transformation. Blake found himself falling for Emily in a way he had never experienced before. The confident man, who thought he controlled everything, was now overwhelmed by a force stronger than money or success: true love. Blake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He hated having his boldness questioned. "What challenge?" he asked, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. Caleb cast an amused glance around the table before discreetly pointing at a waitress taking an order at the counter. "Marry a girl from here. Not as a joke. Not for a night. For real." Laughter rippled through the table, but Blake wasn't laughing. He studied the young woman. She was nothing like the elegant women he was used to. Her slightly wrinkled uniform and stained apron spoke of a tough life. Yet, there was something about her, a sincerity, a light that contrasted with the superficial world he knew. "Deal sealed," he declared, standing up, provoking a wave of excitement. He walked up to her with his usual confidence. "Emily, right?" he asked, reading her name tag. She looked up, wary. "Yes. And you are?" "Blake Anderson." His name didn't seem to impress her. Better yet, she frowned slightly, as if trying to remember where she had heard it before. "And?" she replied, crossing her arms. He smiled. "What if I asked you out?" She burst out laughing. "Is this a hidden camera prank?" Blake felt something he hadn't in a long time, a challenge. He was convinced he had seen and experienced it all, but he was about to discover that he was far from it. Blake watched the young woman. She looked exhausted, but her gaze was sharp, attentive. Her uniform was impeccable despite the long hours of work, and she moved with quiet efficiency. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have noticed her at all. "And what do I get out of this?" he asked, crossing his arms. Caleb grinned, amused. "If you last 6 months, I'll give you my villa in Malibu." A murmur of excitement ran through the table. It wasn't about money. Blake had more than he could ever spend. It was about pride. He never backed down from a challenge. "Deal," he declared. The next day, he returned to the restaurant and waited for Emily to finish her shift. When she stepped out, tired but smiling, he approached her. "I'll be direct," he said. "Let's have dinner together." Emily narrowed her eyes, suspicious. "Why me?" Blake smiled. "Why not?" She sized him up for a long moment before shrugging. "All right. But don't expect me to be impressed." He chuckled. "I'd almost be disappointed if you were." What he didn't know yet was that this bet would change far more than just his marital status. Emily wasn't just a waitress. She had her own strength, her own dreams, and she wouldn't let herself be molded into his world. On the contrary, it might be him who would end up changing. Blake, however, couldn't stop watching her. He had never paid attention to people outside his social circle, but he had to admit, there was something about Emma. A quiet dignity, a determination that showed in every one of her movements. Curious as much as challenged, he got up and walked to the counter. Emma barely looked up as she took his order. "Black coffee," he said lightly. She rang it up with a nod. $1.50, sir." Blake smirked. "Can I pay with a dinner instead?" Emma finally looked up, assessing him. "If this is a joke, it's a bad one." "It's not," he assured her. "Just an honest offer." She sighed, clearly tired of insistent customers. "Look, I don't have time for games." "And what if it isn't one?" he countered calmly. She hesitated, then handed him his coffee. "Have a good day." Blake returned to his table under the amused stares of his friends. "This is going to be harder than I thought," Caleb teased. But for Blake, it was far from over. If she wasn't impressed by money, he would have to find another way. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a thrill of excitement that had nothing to do with winning a simple bet. Blake wasted no time putting his plan into action. The very next day, he returned to the restaurant, determined to earn Emma's trust. But unlike what he had imagined, she wasn't swayed by his smooth words or calculated charm. "Are you still here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow as she saw him settle at a table. "The coffee is better here," he replied with a smirk. Emma didn't let herself be distracted. She knew men like him all too well. Men who thought they could get whatever they wanted with a snap of their fingers. But Blake was persistent. He quickly learned what time she finished her shift and started waiting for her, always finding an excuse to talk. Little by little, he discovered more about her. Her unconditional love for her daughter, her dream of opening her own bakery one day, the hardships she had endured. One evening, as he once again asked her to have dinner with him, she sighed. "Why are you so insistent?" she asked, intrigued. "Because I think you deserve more than just a cup of coffee and an exhausting workday." Emma stared at him for a moment, unsettled. For the first time, he didn't just look like an arrogant man. Maybe there was something more behind that overly confident smile. "All right," she finally said. "Just one dinner." Blake smiled, convinced that this was the beginning of his victory. But he had no idea he was about to be caught in his own game. Blake looked up at her with a confident smile. "Excuse me, but you look like you're having a busy day." Emma paused for a second, surprised by the sudden attention. "Like every day," she simply replied with a shrug. "Have you been working here long?" he asked, feigning innocence. She frowned slightly. "A few years." "Why do you ask?" Blake raised an eyebrow, amused by her skepticism. "Just curiosity. You seem different from the others." Emma let out a brief laugh, shaking her head. "I'm sure that's a line you use often." Maybe, he admitted with a smirk. But this time, it's genuine. She didn't respond right away. This man, with his expensive suit and self-assured demeanor, had nothing in common with her world. Yet, he didn't seem condescending. Just intrigued. If you want a coffee or a meal, just say so, she finally said, getting back to work. Blake watched her walk away, a smirk playing on his lips. This woman wasn't easily impressed, and that was exactly what made this bet even more interesting. As he pulled out his phone, he sent a message to Caleb. Challenge accepted. Emma let out a small sigh, placing her tray on a nearby table. Why me? She asked, crossing her arms. Blake smiled, finding her defensive attitude refreshing. Why not you? She shook her head. Look, if this is some kind of joke or a bet between friends, you're wasting your time. He raised his hands in innocence. Not at all. I just want to talk to you. No tricks, I promise. Emma studied him for a moment, trying to see through his confident mask. It was obvious he wasn't used to being told no. All right, she finally said, surprising even herself. But just a coffee. And it'll be at Joe's, not one of your 5-star restaurants. Blake nodded, satisfied. Joe's, perfect. Tomorrow night. She hesitated for a second before agreeing. Fine. But don't be late. I don't have time to waste. Blake watched Emma return to work, a smirk tugging at his lips. This bet was getting more and more interesting. The next day, Blake arrived at Joe's Cafe, a modest little place far from the upscale neighborhoods he usually frequented. He sat at a table by the window and waited. He never waited for anyone, but this time, he was willing to make an exception. Emma arrived a few minutes late, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater. Nothing fancy, but she had a natural presence that stood out from the carefully curated world Blake was used to. She sat across from him, placing her bag beside her. I'm surprised you actually showed up, she said, taking off her coat. I like keeping my promises, he replied, handing her a menu. She raised an eyebrow. That's nice, but let's be clear, I'm not impressed by money or status. Blake smiled, amused. I figured. That's actually what I like about you. Emma shook her head, chuckling softly. So, why this coffee? He took a moment before answering. I just want to get to know you. No pretense, no expectations. She studied him, searching for the catch. All right. But let me be clear, I'm not a challenge to be one. Blake nodded. We'll see. The bet was taking a turn he hadn't anticipated.